On July 23, 2024, at exactly 10 in the morning, a boardwalk 2 miles from Old Faithful ceased to exist. Not gradually, not with warning, not with any of the signals that the most sophisticated volcanic monitoring network on the planet, 17 GPS stations, satellite radar arrays, a permanent seismological research station, and decades of continuous scientific observation should have detected before the ground beneath 200 tourists decided to detonate. The boardwalk was there. Then a column of water, rock, and mud between 400 and 600 feet tall was there instead. Boulders weighing hundreds of pounds each arced through the air like artillery rounds and landed in the Firehole River. The benches were gone. The fence was gone. The infrastructure that had stood in Biscuit Basin for decades was splinters in the mud before the sound of the explosion finished crossing the valley. 0 casualties. By a margin of timing and luck so thin that the scientists who studied it afterward described it in the careful, restrained language of people who understood exactly how different the outcome could have been. Biscuit Basin is still closed, not temporarily, not pending a routine safety inspection that clears it for the next season. Closed. Superintendent Cam Shawley has stated that reopening will only happen once the USGS Yellowstone Volcano Observatory gives a formal go-ahead. As of the spring of 2026, that go-ahead has not been given. The scientists who are responsible for understanding what happened there on July 23, 2024, and what the ground in that basin is doing right now, those scientists have looked at the data available to them and decided that the boardwalk stays closed. That decision is the most important sentence in this entire story, and nobody is talking about it. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will understand something that the coverage of Yellowstone, the coverage that oscillates between breathless disaster movie speculation and reflexive scientific reassurance, is entirely missing. Not just about the explosion at Biscuit Basin, not just about the 3 simultaneous anomalies that have been developing in the same park across the same 8-month window, but about what the data actually says when you strip away both the panic and the dismissal and read the numbers for what they are. And what those numbers say is this: Yellowstone is doing things in 2026 that it has not done in decades, simultaneously in the same system, and the scientists responsible for monitoring it are choosing their words with a precision that deserves to be read as carefully as the words themselves. The gap between what is being said and what is being measured is where this story actually lives. To understand that gap, you have to start with the ground. Specifically, with a patch of ground 19 miles across sitting on the north rim of the Yellowstone Caldera, just south of Norris Geyser Basin near Gibbon Falls. 19 miles across is roughly the footprint of the city of Chicago. A patch of earth that size, sometime in the period between July 2025 and the present, rose approximately 1 inch, not collapsed, not shifted laterally, rose. Pushed upward from below, measurably, consistently, in a pattern that 17 GPS stations and satellite radar interferometry data confirmed independently. More than 100 earthquakes accompanied the uplift during 2025. Another swarm followed in November. The largest of those earthquakes measured magnitude 7. The uplift paused in mid-January 2026. Scientists have named it the Norris Uplift Anomaly, and the USGS geophysicist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, Michael Poland, described it with words that were chosen with a deliberateness that the casual reader can miss if they are not paying attention. He called it stunning, and then immediately said, it does not mean the volcano is about to erupt. Both of those things can be true. They are both true. The question that nobody is pressing is what it means that they are both true simultaneously, in the same sentence, from the same scientist, about the same piece of ground. When a scientist calls something stunning and then immediately reassures you that the stunning thing does not mean what the stunning thing sounds like it might mean, the correct analytical response is not to choose one half of that statement and discard the other. It is to hold both halves together and ask what they reveal about the space between them. The space between stunning and it does not mean eruption is the space where the actual story of Yellowstone in 2026 exists. Here is what the Norris Uplift Anomaly actually is at a geological level, because this is where the data stops being abstract and starts being concrete in ways that matter. The uplift is sourced approximately 9 miles below the surface. 9 miles down, something is causing a pressure change large enough to push 19 miles of ground surface 1 inch upward. At that depth, in Yellowstone's geological structure, the candidates are limited. Hydrothermal fluid movement, magmatic gas migration, or the breathing of the magmatic system itself, the molten rock that sits beneath the caldera, not fully liquid, not fully solid, in the specific thermodynamic state that the science calls a mush zone, responding to pressure changes in ways that produce surface deformation as a measurable signal. The USGS is careful to say the bulge is not a magmatic eruption precursor. They are careful to say that the depth, 9 miles, is not the shallow deformation profile that would precede a caldera eruption. A real eruption precursor, they explain, would show deformation much closer to the surface accompanied by large earthquake swarms, chemistry changes in gas vents, rapid accelerating uplift rather than the gradual inch over months. Those signals are not present. The USGS is not wrong about this. The precursors to a caldera eruption are not present. But here's the detail that gets buried in the reassurance. The Norris Geyser Basin, which sits directly adjacent to the area where the uplift is occurring, has a documented history of ground deformation events going back decades. Between 1996 and 2004, the same general area accumulated 5 inches of total uplift, 5 inches over 8 years, followed by subsidence, followed by return to baseline. What is happening now is 1 inch in roughly 6 months in the same location. The rate of the current uplift is not unprecedented for this specific area. But it is occurring in the context of 2 other things that are happening simultaneously in the same park, in the same hydrothermal system, in the same 8-month window. And that simultaneity is the part that deserves to be examined without the reassurance running interference on the examination. Here's the second thing. On New Year's Eve 2025 at 10:02 p.m. Pacific Time, Steamboat Geyser erupted. Steamboat is not a normal geyser. It is the tallest active geyser on Earth. Its water column can reach 400 feet. Taller than the Statue of Liberty. And its behavior over the past several years has followed a trajectory that the scientists monitoring it describe in terms that, if you read them carefully rather than quickly, carry considerably more weight than the reassuring framing that surrounds them. In 2019 and 2020, at the peak of what researchers called its modern reawakening, Steamboat erupted 48 times per year, a rhythm, a pattern, the kind of measurable, trackable, predictable behavior that makes a geological system comprehensible to the scientists studying it. Then the rhythm began to change. 2021, 20 times. 2022, 11 times. 2023, 9 times. 2024, 6 times. 2025, 5 times, the last of which occurred on April 14th. Then silence. 230 days of silence in a geyser that had been erupting dozens of times annually just 5 years earlier. And then, on the last night of 2025, the eruption that a pilot flying over the park in the dark caught on camera. 400 feet of water against a black winter sky, the geyser announcing its return after 230 days without a word. Michael Pollan described Steamboat's behavioral shift with a directness that is worth reading slowly. He said that in the past, they would see a buildup of minor activity that would culminate in a major eruption. Now, they are not seeing those minor eruptions lead to anything, and then, with the clarity of a scientist who has decided the data says what it says regardless of how it sounds, the sequence of frequent predictable eruptions is probably over. That is not a reassurance. That is a change in the fundamental behavioral pattern of the tallest active geyser on Earth, described by the scientist responsible for monitoring it as probably permanent, occurring in the same system, in the same park, in the same period as the 19-mile ground uplift at Norris and the explosion at Biscuit Basin. The USGS says the bulge and the geysers are different systems. The bulge is magmatic, deep, sourced in the mush zone. The geysers are hydrothermal, shallower, sourced in the water and steam circulation of the crust above the magmatic system. Officially, they are unrelated. Officially, 3 anomalies in 8 months in the same park are 3 separate, coincidental, independently explicable events. The word officially is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Here's the third thing. On February 7th, 2026, Echinus Geyser erupted for the first time in 6 years. Echinus is not a standard geyser. It is the largest known acidic geyser in the world with a pH of 3. 3. Acid hot enough and concentrated enough to eat through steel. It had been dormant since 2020, silent for 6 years, in a park that was simultaneously experiencing a 19-mile ground uplift and a geyser whose eruption frequency had collapsed from 48 times a year to 5. And then Echinus erupted. And then it erupted again on February 9th, and the 12th, and the 15th. And since February 16th, 2026, it has been erupting every 2 to 5 hours, sending water 20 to 30 feet into the air, each eruption lasting 2 to 3 minutes. 3 anomalies, 8 months. 1 park, 1 hydrothermal system, 1 magmatic system underneath. All of it happening in the same geographic space, in the same temporal window. The USGS says these things are separate. The USGS says the system is behaving within the range of historical variability. The USGS says, and this is the phrase that Michael Pollan has used in every public communication, the phrase he appears to have chosen specifically and deliberately as his anchoring statement. It is, Yellowstone being Yellowstone, those words are true. And those words are also the precise words that someone responsible for monitoring the most dangerous volcanic system in North America, someone who is also responsible for not triggering a mass panic in a park that receives nearly 5 million visitors per year, would choose regardless of whether the anomalies they are observing are within the range of normal variability or something more. Because the institutional function of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory is not just to monitor, it is to communicate. And the communication obligation of a monitoring agency attached to a site with 5 million annual visitors and 4 gateway communities with a combined year-round population of 23,000 people is not simple. It is not simple in the way that the communication obligations of scientists monitoring a system in a remote location with no proximate human population are simple. At Yellowstone, the communication is always happening in the shadow of what honest communication about genuine uncertainty could produce. This is not an accusation. This is an acknowledgement of a real institutional tension that the scientists themselves have written about, that the sociological literature on hazard communication has documented extensively, and that the specific language choices of the scientists speaking publicly about the 2026 Yellowstone anomalies reflect in ways that are worth examining carefully. Jamie Farrell is the chief seismologist at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory and a professor at the University of Utah. He co-authored the April 2025 paper in Nature that pinpointed the cap of Yellowstone's magma chamber at just 8 kilometers below the surface. That number, 8 kilometers, is the number that every other piece of data needs to be read against. Because Michael Pollan's reassurance that 9 miles is not the shallow deformation profile of an eruption precursor is technically accurate. But 8 kilometers is not 9 miles. 8 kilometers is the top of the magma system. What Pollan is saying is that the source of the current deformation signal is 9 miles down, deep in the mush zone, well below the cap of the magma chamber. What Farrell's paper established is that the cap of what that deformation is pushing against is 8 kilometers below the surface. The pressure change is originating 9 miles down. The lid it is pushing against is 4 miles up. This is not a reason for panic. The scientists are right that the magnitude of the current deformation, the depth of its source, and the absence of the other precursors all place this event well within the category of Yellowstone being Yellowstone. But it is a reason to read the data without the reassurance running in front of it, because the reassurance and the data are not the same thing, and at Yellowstone, confusing them has consequences. Dan Zurison, USGS geologist emeritus, was asked directly whether the Norris bulge means the clock is ticking. He said impending doom is not coming anytime soon. He called the uplift observations a positive sign because it shows they now have tools that can tell them things they would not have been able to know otherwise. Pollan said the same thing from a different angle. If there was actually a chance this was a magmatic system about to erupt, the deformation would be much, much shallower and accompanied by other huge changes. Every precursor a real caldera eruption would produce is absent. Shallow deformation, absent. Rapid accelerating uplift, absent. Large magnitude earthquake swarms, absent. Measurable chemistry changes in gas vent emissions, absent. The scientific judgment that this is not a caldera eruption precursor is not a reassurance for public consumption. It is the honest assessment of the available data. The data does not support caldera eruption as an imminent threat. But here's the question that the caldera eruption framing consistently crowds out. The question that is more urgent, more practically relevant, and more immediately dangerous for the 5 million people who are going to walk into this park over the next 12 months. What is the actual hazard profile of Yellowstone in the current anomalous state if caldera eruption is correctly removed from the table? And the answer to that question is where the story stops being about the dramatic and starts being about the real. The USGS is explicit about the hazard hierarchy at Yellowstone. The hazard and risk from large earthquakes, they state directly, is much larger than from a volcanic eruption, because earthquakes happen so much more frequently. The hydrothermal explosion hazard, the steam bomb in the ground, the superheated water pocket that flashes to vapor in a confined space and detonates the surface above it, is not the disaster movie scenario. It is the documented, cataloged, historically recurring, and presently active hazard that Biscuit Basin demonstrated with a 400 to 600 foot plume and a boardwalk reduced to splinters on July 23, 2024. Yellowstone has documented at least 25 hydrothermal explosion craters wider than 100 meters inside the park boundary. The average recurrence interval for a large hydrothermal explosion is approximately 700 years. Indian Pond, north of Yellowstone Lake, is a crater approximately 2,900 years old, the remnant of a hydrothermal explosion that was, in geological terms, recent. The crater is visible. It is measurable. It is sitting inside a park that logged 4,762,988 visitors in 2025 alone, the second highest annual total in the park's recorded history, a number that is up 5.3% over the year before. The July 2024 Biscuit Basin explosion is now described by the scientific community as the best documented hydrothermal explosion in Yellowstone's recorded history. That description carries two pieces of information simultaneously. It is the best documented, which means the monitoring infrastructure captured it in more detail than any previous event of its kind. And it was a hydrothermal explosion, the category of event that the USGS identifies as greater practical hazard than volcanic eruption, occurring in a basin that is now, 18 months later, still closed because the scientists responsible for assessing it have not yet determined that it is safe to reopen. The ground at Biscuit Basin is still doing something that the scientists are not yet confident enough about to allow the public back onto it. The boardwalk is still splinters in the mud. The benches are still gone. Black Diamond Pool is still simmering the way it always simmered, in a basin where the ground exploded without warning at 10 in the morning while tourists were present, and where the absence of casualties is a function of timing and geometry rather than any early warning that the monitoring system provided. Now add the earthquake. Because the earthquake hazard at Yellowstone is not theoretical, not geological abstraction, not a risk that exists only in modeling scenarios and probability calculations, it has a date, it has a time, it has a body count. August 17th, 1959 at 11:37 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. A magnitude, 7. 3 earthquake struck 6.5 miles west-northwest of West Yellowstone. The Hebgen Lake earthquake. Within seconds, 50 million cubic yards of rock tore off the south wall of Madison Canyon and buried a campground under a slide that was moving at a speed no person and no vehicle could have outrun. Within minutes, a new lake had begun to form behind the debris dam, Earthquake Lake, which still exists. Within 24 hours, 289 springs in the Firehole geyser basins had erupted as geysers. 160 of them had never erupted in recorded history. The earthquake rewired the hydrothermal plumbing of the entire basin in a single event. 28 people died that night. Most of them were under the Madison slide before they knew the earthquake had happened. The Hebgen Lake fault system that produced the 1959 event is still active. It has not been released by any subsequent earthquake of comparable magnitude. The stress that accumulates on fault systems does not dissipate through time. It accumulates through time. And the geography that a comparable event would traverse in 2026 is not the geography of 1959. When the gateway communities were smaller, the infrastructure was thinner, and the visitor numbers were a fraction of what they are today. Walk the geographic ladder of a 1959 scale event in 2026. Biscuit Basin, already closed, already documented as hydrothermally unstable, boardwalk already gone. Norris Geyser, basin where the 19-mile uplift anomaly is centered, where the 100-plus earthquakes of 2025 occurred, where the ground is currently standing 1 inch higher than it stood in July. Gibbon Falls, downstream from Norris in the drainage system that connects the northern geyser basins to the Madison River corridor. Gardner, Montana, population 818, sitting 7/10 of a mile from the only year-round entrance to the park, the gateway community closest to the Norris uplift, the community with the least distance between itself and the source of the deformation anomaly that the scientists are watching with 17 GPS stations. West Yellowstone, Montana, population 1,474, 9/10 of a mile from the 1959 epicenter, the community that exists in the closest geographic relationship to the fault system that produced the most destructive earthquake in Yellowstone's modern history. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, population 10,680. Cody, Wyoming, population 10,463. Combined year-round population of those 4 communities, approximately 20,500 people, against a summer visitor load that, on a peak August afternoon, places more tourists inside the park boundary simultaneously than the entire combined population of every gateway community combined, by a factor of more than 10. 4,762,988 visitors in 2025, standing on the ground above the magma system, walking the boardwalks, the ones that are still open, above the hydrothermal features, photographing the geysers, pulling into the parking areas at Norris Geyser Basin, where the ground is currently doing something that 17 GPS stations and satellite radar are tracking in real time, and that the scientists responsible for explaining it are calling both stunning and normal in the same sentence. Next summer, by every available projection, more of them are coming. This is the picture that exists underneath the reassurance. Not caldera eruption, not the supervolcano scenario of the disaster films, the ash cloud that covers the continent, the climate disruption that rewrites civilization. The scientists are right that those scenarios are not what the current data supports. But the scenarios that the current data does support, hydrothermal explosions in a basin that exploded without warning 18 months ago and remains closed today, seismic events in a fault system that last ruptured at magnitude 7, 367 years ago, the full range of geological consequences that a large earthquake would trigger in a hydrothermal system that is currently doing 3 anomalous things simultaneously. Those scenarios are where the practical risk lives, And those scenarios involve real people in real proximity to the source of the anomalies that the scientists are carefully, precisely, and deliberately watching. Farrell put the context in terms that deserve to be read against everything else he and his colleagues have said. Yellowstone, he said, is in many ways a laboratory volcano. What we learn here can be used to better understand volcanoes in other parts of the world that are far more active but harder to study. Campi Flegrei in Italy, Santorini in Greece. He is right. Yellowstone is one of the most comprehensively monitored volcanic systems on Earth, precisely because its accessibility and its scale make it a scientific resource without parallel. The monitoring infrastructure is extraordinary. The scientific expertise focused on it is extraordinary. The data being collected from 17 GPS stations and satellite radar and continuous seismological monitoring is the best available picture of what a large, complex, restless volcanic system looks like when it is doing what it is doing. The question is what it is doing. The data says a 19-mile patch of ground on the north rim of the caldera rose 1 inch between July 2025 and January 2026, accompanied by more than 100 earthquakes, and then paused. A geyser that erupted 48 times annually at its modern peak erupted 5 times in 2025, fell silent for 230 days, and then returned on New Year's Eve with a single eruption whose behavioral profile, the scientists say, is probably a permanent departure from the predictable pattern that characterized its recent activity. A dormant acidic geyser reactivated after 6 years of silence in February 2026 and has been erupting every 2 to 5 hours since. A basin 2 miles from Old Faithful exploded in July 2024 and has been closed ever since because the scientists monitoring it have not cleared it for reopening. The scientists say these events have individual explanations that place each of them within the range of Yellowstone's known historical behavior. The depth and magnitude of the deformation signal does not match the profile of an eruption precursor. The system is being monitored with unprecedented precision, and the precursors that would indicate a genuine escalation toward caldera eruption are not present. Yellowstone is being Yellowstone. Both of these things are simultaneously true. The events have explanations that scientists are confident in, and those explanations do not fully account for the timing, the simultaneity, and the specific combination of a closed basin, an anomalous uplift, a behaviorally altered geyser, and a reactivated dormant feature all occurring in the same park across the same 8-month window. The explanation for each individual event is satisfactory. The explanation for all of them together at the same time in the same system is a sentence that the scientists have not yet finished writing. Michael Poland chose the word stunning deliberately. He is not a scientist who uses words carelessly. The gap between stunning and it does not mean eruption is the gap in which the honest uncertainty lives. And the honest uncertainty at Yellowstone in 2026 is not about caldera eruption. It is about what the system is doing that produced 3 simultaneous anomalies in 8 months, whether those anomalies are genuinely independent or connected at a depth and through a mechanism that the current monitoring cannot yet fully resolve, and what the hazard profile looks like for 5 million visitors standing on top of a system that is doing things it has not done in decades, while the scientists responsible for assessing it are still watching, still measuring, still choosing their words with the careful precision of people who understand that what they say carries consequences that go beyond the technical. The Norris uplift paused in January 2026. Paused, not ended. Paused, not explained. The 17 GPS stations are still listening. The satellite radar is still collecting interferometric data. The scientists are still collating the earthquake records. And the question of why the uplift paused, whether it paused because the pressure source 9 miles down reached equilibrium, or because it is building toward something, or because the system is doing something that the current monitoring framework is not yet fully equipped to interpret. That question does not have a public answer yet. The scientists are working on it. They are doing so with honesty and rigor and with monitoring tools that are better than anything that existed the last time the Norris area showed this kind of behavior. And they are also doing so with the institutional knowledge that what they say will be received by a public that oscillates between dismissal and panic, and that the communication challenge at Yellowstone is inseparable from the scientific challenge in ways that make the word stunning, and the phrase it does not mean eruption necessary components of the same sentence. Biscuit Basin is still closed. The boardwalk is still splinters. Black Diamond Pool is still simmering in a basin that detonated on a summer morning with tourists present and has not been declared safe since. Steamboat erupted on New Year's Eve after 230 days of silence, and the scientists say its predictable pattern is probably over without being able to say what replaces it. Echinus has been erupting every 2 to 5 hours since February 16, 2026. The ground south of Norris is still standing 1 inch higher than it stood in July 2025. The magma, 9 miles below, is still in the thermodynamic state that produces surface deformation when it breathes. And 4,762,988 people visited Yellowstone in 2025, with more projected for 2026, and most of them will arrive in the summer months, when the park is at maximum occupancy and the gateway communities are outnumbered by visitors by a factor of more than 10 to 1. 631,000 years have passed since the last caldera eruption at Yellowstone. The scientists are right that the current data does not indicate the next one is imminent. They are right about what the data says and what it does not say, and what the absence of the key precursors means. Every number they have cited to support that assessment is accurate, and yet Biscuit Basin is still closed. That is the data point that nobody inside the reassurance framework has yet produced a satisfying explanation for. Not because the closure is evidence of an impending catastrophe, but because the closure is the signal that the scientists most directly responsible for assessing the ground at Yellowstone, the people with access to the full data set, the people who can see everything the GPS stations and the seismometers and the gas sensors and the thermal cameras are collecting, have looked at all of it and decided that they cannot yet tell the public the basin is safe to return to, 18 months after the explosion. Into the spring of 2026, with the anomalous uplift at Norris paused but not explained, with Echinus erupting every few hours in a system that the USGS says is officially unrelated to the bulge, but that exists within the same park, the same watershed, the same geological structure. The honest answer from every scientist who will give one is this: nobody knows yet exactly what the system is doing. Nobody knows yet whether the 3 anomalies in 8 months are independent coincidences or signals of a connected process that the current monitoring is still working to characterize. Nobody knows yet when Biscuit Basin will be cleared to reopen, or what additional data the scientists need to see before they are confident making that determination. Nobody knows yet whether the Norris Uplift's January pause is the beginning of a return to baseline or a pause in an ongoing process. What is known as the numbers: 19 miles across, 1 inch of uplift, 9 miles deep, more than 100 earthquakes, 230 days of silence from the tallest active geyser on Earth, 6 years of dormancy in an acidic geyser that is now erupting every 2 to 5 hours, 400 to 600 feet of plume at a basin that is still closed 18 months later. 28 dead at Hebgen Lake in 1959 in an event whose fault system is still loaded. 4,762,988 visitors in 2025. 17 GPS stations still listening. The magma 9 miles down still breathing. And next summer, the visitors are coming back. They are coming back to the park with the best volcanic monitoring network in the world, run by scientists who are doing extraordinary work with extraordinary tools, communicating with the honesty and institutional caution of people who understand that their words carry weight far beyond the technical. They are coming back to a park where the most dangerous feature is not the volcano in the disaster movie, but the steam in the ground, the fault in the rock, and the basin that exploded at 10 in the morning on a summer day and where the boardwalk is still splinters. Whether they are coming back to a park that is doing what it always does, or to a park that is doing something that nobody alive has ever seen the beginning of, is the question that the 17 GPS stations and the satellite radar and the continuous seismological monitoring are trying to answer. The scientists are working on it. They are honest about what they know and what they do not. They are choosing their words with the precision that the stakes demand. Biscuit Basin remains closed. The scientists have not yet given the go-ahead. That is where the story is. Not in the disaster scenario. In the gap between stunning and it does not mean eruption, in the basin where the boardwalk is still splinters, in the geyser whose pattern has probably permanently changed, in the uplift that paused without explanation in January and may or may not have resumed in ways that GPS stations are still measuring, in the question that the data raises and that the current monitoring is working toward answering, and that 5 million visitors will be standing on top of this summer while it remains, for now, unanswered. Subscribe to World Brief Live right now and turn on notifications, because Yellowstone is not the story it is usually told as. It is not the supervolcano waiting to end civilization, and it is not the stable, fully understood system that the reassurance framing sometimes implies. It is a laboratory that is currently running an experiment that the scientists studying it call both stunning and normal in the same breath. In a park with 5 million annual visitors, and a boardwalk that is still splinters in the mud, and a basin that has been closed for 18 months because the people responsible for knowing when it is safe to open have not yet decided that it is. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the 3 simultaneous anomalies in 2026 are independent events, or does the timing tell a different story? This is World Brief Live. The ground is 17 GPS stations deep into an answer it has not yet finished giving, and 4 million people are planning to stand on it this summer.